In this lesson, we'll discuss how to use the transform tools. So here we are picking up directly where we left off in the last lesson. I have this box that's located sort of far away from the origin of the scene. And what I want to do is be able to move it around inside of the scene interactively within the scene view. And I can do that using the Move tool. Now, the Move tool is this little icon here on the left-hand toolbar. And I'm just going to select it and then come over and click on my box. Now, in order to frame up my box so I can more easily see exactly what's happening, you might think that we need to come down, grab the View tool, and now tap F on our keyboard. But Houdini gives us a very, very useful little shortcut for accessing the View tool interactively within another tool. So let's go back and select the Move tool. And now when I want to frame up my box, all I have to do is select it. Now, to temporarily enter the view mode, just hold down your spacebar. As soon as you press and hold down spacebar, you'll notice that the toolbar across the top of the scene view lets you know that you're in the View tool currently, and the View tool itself is now highlighted. Now that we're in this view mode, I can tap F. That will frame up the box. Now I'm going to release the spacebar, and as soon as I do, notice that this toolbar across the top tells me that I'm back in the Move tool. And also notice that the View camera icon here on the far left is no longer highlighted. So now let's discuss the Move tool here. You'll see that the icon looks sort of like these crosshairs. First off, notice that the crosshairs are colored: red, green, and blue. Now, those colors refer to what you see as this little floating icon here in the bottom left of the viewport. Y is always green, Z is always blue, and X is always red. Well, that color coding system you'll find throughout Houdini and with all of the various tools that we use. You also get this little information when you hover over that icon, like we're just hovering over the green arrow now. And notice that, oops, I right-clicked there by accident. If we hover over that green arrow, right beside our mouse cursor, the letter Y shows up. And what that's telling us is that now we can move that box constrained only to the Y axis. So I'm just moving it up and down, and that's it. I'm not going to be able to move, regardless of how I do my mouse, in any other direction except Y, up and down. Well, the same applies for X as well, and for Z. Now, Houdini also gives you the ability to control the position of the box in two different axes simultaneously. And to access that, all you need to do is sort of hover your mouse in the area in between the arrows. So right now I have the Y. You can see it sort of glow when I hover over it. And I can hover over Z, and you'll see that it glows as I hover over it. If I hover in the middle, you get this little icon that looks like a tiny grid, and the mouse cursor tells me that now I am going to be limited to movement in the X and Y positions. So now, regardless of how I move my mouse, I'm only able to move that box in the X and Y positions. So it's just a way of constraining the movement of the box to two axes at one time. That's also available for Y and Z and X and Z, depending upon where you have the mouse. If you hover over the dead middle, dead center here, you'll get the X, Y, and Z movement ability. So this means that I can now move my box in all three directions. Now, this is usually not the way that you want to move geometry, because it's very difficult to tell, since we're being presented with a two-dimensional scene view, exactly where we're positioning our box. It's always smarter to either move in one direction at a time, or constrain to two directions before starting a move. Another handy shortcut is if you need to move in very fine movements, like you just want to barely move this box a little bit, you can do so by holding down the Shift key while you're moving in any of the constrained directions. So for instance, I'm going to hover over the X axes here, hold Shift, and when I move, regardless of how these giant moves I make with my mouse, I'm just barely moving the box, just fractions of a unit of distance. Now, as soon as I release Shift and grab, I'm able to move in much bigger steps. So it's just a way of getting more control over your movements there in the viewport. So that's the Move tool. Let's now talk about the Rotate tool. So I'll move down here, and right beneath the Move tool in the left-hand toolbar, you'll see the Rotate tool. So when I click on it, my icon changes here in the middle, and you'll see that I now have these circular sort of handles for this geometry. I have the red, which will constrain me to rotations in the X direction. The green, which will constrain me to rotations in Y. And the blue here, which will constrain me to rotations in Z. Now the rotation of this object is based off of the very center of the object. And you'll see this little dot here. That little dot is known as the pivot point. And you can change the pivot point so that your rotations can be offset from the dead center of the box. Let me show you what I'm talking about here. I'm going to hold down the space bar to temporarily enter the view mode and just sort of rotate my box around a little bit here to get a little better view. Okay, I'm also going to reset those rotations so that they're as close as I can get them back to 0 here interactively. And you'll notice by doing that, I'm not able to actually square these up directly. This is a really good position, or a good place where you might want to just type in those values over in the parameter view. So just like we moved the box before by typing in a value in the translate area, I can very easily type in values here in the rotate area. So I'm just going to click my mouse inside of the X rotation property and type in 0. Now I'll hit Tab on the keyboard. That'll move me over into the Y parameter, type 0. Hit Tab, that'll move me into the Z, and type 0. So now I've got that box absolutely with no rotations on it, and it's perfectly squared up again. So we have our Rotate tool selected, and we have the box selected. And what we want to do is offset the pivot of this box. Now, the way that you adjust pivot point is by tapping the Insert key on your keyboard. So I'm going to just press Insert, and you'll notice that my handle here changes. That it now looks sort of like half of a transform gizmo. Like we had the Move tool earlier, and we had this basically with the crosshairs went all the way across. The Insert tool, you only get about half of the Move tool, and that way you know you're working with a pivot. So I'm going to move that pivot down below the box a little bit. So I'm just going to constrain that to the Y direction, click, and drag it down. Just anywhere below the box is fine. Now that I have my pivot in place, I can hit Insert again, and I'm back to using the Rotate tool. Only now, whenever the box is selected, and you have the Rotate tool, you'll notice that the rotations happen around this offset pivot point. So we're no longer rotating around the center of the box, but from this offset pivot point. And this will be very handy for us later whenever we're modeling out parts of the car. Now before we move on to the Scale tool, I want to point out that Houdini actually uses multiple coordinate systems when you're dealing with moving geometry. For instance, if we were to rotate this box, and now decide that we want to move the box, we're going to choose the Move tool again here. But notice that the coordination of the arrows, the directions that they're pointing, no longer are the same as what they are here on this little icon that we pointed out earlier. In the icon, Y is pointed directly straight up. However, the Y-axis of the box is now pointed at an angle. It's sort of oriented along with the position of the box, no longer oriented with the world. Well, Houdini gives us a way to adjust that so that we can move in either coordinate system upon choice. And the way that you access that change is to hover over the handle itself, just anywhere in the handle, right-click, and change that over to Align Handle World. Okay? As soon as you do, you'll notice that the handle is now completely back aligned with what you see this icon being on the left. So a movement in Y will move it directly up and down. Now sometimes it may be handy for you to want to move that object in coordinates with the way that the box is pointing or the way that the object is facing. To achieve that mode again, all you have to do is just right-click somewhere on the handle, come up to Align Handle, and change that back to Object. And as soon as you'll notice that your handle is now facing oriented with the position of the box. So now if I need to move it just along the orientation of the box, I can do that. So lastly, let's talk about the Scale tool. Now, to use the scale tool, I'm just going to, for variety's sake here, change up my objects, and let's say we're going to work with the torus. So I've chosen the scale tool from the tools on the toolbar on the left-hand side of the scene view, and I've chosen the torus. I'm going to frame up on the torus by holding down spacebar to enter the view tool, and tap F to frame up that object. Now I can see the scale tool here inside. I see the handle for the scale tool here inside of the torus. But to get a little better view of it, I'm going to turn off the construction grid. Now you can turn off the construction grid by using this icon on the right-hand toolbar. It's this very top icon. All you have to do is click on it and you can hide that grid. Now it might actually help me to see this handle a little better if the handle itself was larger. And I can increase that very simply by using the divide and multiply keys on the keyboard. So by hitting multiply, I'm able to increase the size of the handle, and divide will let me shrink the size of the handle. It's just a handy tip whenever you're working inside of your scene view and you have geometry that might occlude the actual parts of the handle. So I'm just going to make it a little bit bigger, make sure that we have it selected. And let's talk about the scale tool. The scale tool looks a little bit different than it does in some software packages, but it really doesn't take all that much to get used to it. So let's shrink down the size just a little bit here. There we go. So in order to scale everything about the torus uniformly, in other words, just to scale it up in all three axes, X, Y, and Z at the same time, all you have to do is grab these giant red arrows, these tips, just the tip of the arrow. And when you do, you'll see that your cursor shows X, Y, and Z. You can click, and that'll just make the overall torus larger or smaller in all three axes. To scale in one specific axis, you need to grab these little handles that are inside of the scale tool. So notice when I hover over this green one here that I'm locked down to Y, and any scale that I make is just going to scale in the Y direction. Well, the same is true for X and Z. Here's the Z direction. I can hover over just this little bit of the blue handle on the inside, scale in Z. And the same goes for X. I can hover over just the little red bit of the handle and scale in X. Just like the Move tool allows you to move an object in two directions simultaneously, you also have that option with the Scale tool. Now, in order to do that, you grab sort of this cage that's around the tool. So as I hover over this blue part of the cage, you'll see that my mouse shows I can now scale in X and Y simultaneously. So as I click and drag, I'm simultaneously scaling in X and Y. Now the same thing applies for the tool. If you hover over the green, you'll see that you can scale in X and Z at the same time. And if you hover over the red, you'll see that you can scale in Y and Z at the same time. So that wraps up our basic discussion about the transform tools. In the next lesson, we'll start to talk about the handle tool and about choosing different arrangements for our viewport.